The night air hung thick as molasses over the Pacific jungle, heavy with moisture that seemed to press against your lungs with every breath. It was October 1944, somewhere in the dense green hell of the Solomon Islands, where mosquitoes whined their eternal song and shadows played tricks on exhausted minds. Through the undergrowth, Japanese artillery spotters crouched in their camouflaged positions, binoculars pressed tight against sweat-stained faces. They had been watching the American lines for hours, waiting for the right moment, when something caught their attention in the clearing below. Tanks. American Sherman tanks, sitting vulnerably in the open like metal coffins waiting to be filled. But something was wrong with these machines of war. They swayed slightly in the humid breeze, their hulls seeming to flex. One spotter nudged his companion, pointing at the strange sight. The tanks appeared to be collapsing slightly, their rigid forms buckling at odd angles. Muffled laughter rippled through the Japanese positions. What kind of desperate fools had the Americans become, sending damaged equipment into battle? The artillery crews received their coordinates with eager anticipation. Easy targets, sitting ducks, the kind of gift that war rarely offered to soldiers who had been fighting for their lives across countless Pacific atolls. Hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting elevation, calculating distance, preparing to turn American steel into twisted scrap metal. The jungle held its breath as Japanese artillery pieces swiveled into position. Fingers tightened on firing mechanisms. Commands were whispered through the thick air, and then, with a thunderous roar that sent birds screaming from the canopy, the shells began their deadly arc through the darkness. The explosions lit up the night like deadly fireworks, orange flame and black smoke erupting where the Sherman tanks had been sitting moments before. The ground shook. Trees splintered, and when the smoke finally cleared, revealing the devastated clearing in the pale moonlight, the Japanese spotters stared in stunned silence at something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Nothing. They had been firing at absolutely nothing. Where solid steel should have melted and burned, only shredded rubber and canvas fluttered in the breeze like the tattered remnants of some impossible dream. The laughter died in their throats as a chilling realization crept through their ranks. They had been fooled by ghosts. This moment of profound confusion in a Pacific jungle was no accident, no stroke of luck for desperate American forces. It was the calculated result of a shadow war that had been raging alongside the more visible battles of World War II, a conflict fought not with bullets and bombs, but with imagination and illusion. While soldiers died for inches of blood-soaked sand on beaches across the Pacific, another kind of army was waging psychological warfare on an industrial scale. In workshops thousands of miles from the front lines, artists and engineers were crafting weapons that existed only to be destroyed, tanks that weighed less than a motorcycle, and entire military divisions that lived solely in the enemy's mind. The concept wasn't entirely new. Military deception had existed as long as warfare itself. But World War II transformed trickery into science, illusion into strategy, and lies into life-saving truth. The Allies, blessed with resources that seemed limitless compared to their enemy's increasingly desperate situation, had discovered something remarkable. Sometimes the most effective weapon was one that didn't exist at all. Japan's situation in 1944 painted a stark contrast to Allied abundance. Their supply lines stretched thin across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, every shell precious, every gallon of fuel irreplaceable. When Japanese commanders ordered artillery strikes, they were spending resources they could barely afford to lose. The Allies had learned to turn this desperation against itself. Behind the scenes, a new kind of military unit was taking shape, one that recruited from art schools rather than boot camps, that measured success not in territory captured, but in enemy ammunition wasted. These psychological warfare specialists understood something that traditional military minds were only beginning to grasp. In modern warfare, controlling what the enemy believed could be more powerful than controlling what they could see. The rubber tanks swaying in that Pacific jungle were descendants of an entire lineage of military deception. Inflatable aircraft sat on dummy airfields, drawing real bombs toward imaginary targets. Radio operators broadcast the chatter of phantom divisions, complete with fictional commanders and fabricated battle plans. Sound trucks played recordings of tank engines and marching feet, creating the auditory signature of armies that existed only in sound waves and enemy fears. What made these deceptions so devastatingly effective wasn't their technical sophistication, though the craftsmanship was remarkable, but their psychological precision. They exploited the fundamental challenge facing every military commander: the fog of war that made distinguishing truth from fiction a matter of life and death. In a conflict where intelligence could mean the difference between victory and annihilation, the ability to plant false information directly into enemy decision-making processes was nothing short of revolutionary. The Japanese soldiers who had laughed at those wobbling tanks were about to discover just how deadly the truth could be when wrapped in lies. The story of how artists became warriors begins in the most unlikely of places, a converted warehouse in New York City, where men who had spent their lives creating beauty were learning to craft deception. The year was 1943, and the U.S. Army was quietly assembling what would become one of the war's most unusual fighting units, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. The recruitment process read like a casting call for a surreal Broadway production. Wanted: theatrical designers who understood how lighting could transform reality, sound engineers who could make a whisper sound like a roar, visual artists who could paint lies so convincing that enemy generals would stake their strategies on them. These weren't the broad-shouldered farm boys and city tough guys who filled most army ranks. These were creative minds being weaponized for war. Captain Frederick Fox, a former window display designer from New York's Fifth Avenue, found himself teaching soldiers how to make plywood look like steel plating. His hands, once steady with paintbrushes creating Christmas displays, now guided younger men in the delicate art of visual deception. "We're not trying to fool photographers," he would tell his students during those early training sessions. "We're trying to fool people who want to kill us." The science behind their craft was more complex than simply inflating rubber tanks and hoping for the best. Every detail mattered. The way shadows fell across fake equipment, the patterns of wear and mud that made props look battle-tested, even the positioning of dummy soldiers that suggested real human presence. Artists found themselves studying the technical specifications of actual military hardware with the intensity of engineers, memorizing not just how a Sherman tank looked, but how it moved, how it sat when parked, how its crew would position themselves around it. In the converted barns and warehouses where they trained, these soldier artists developed techniques that would have impressed Hollywood set designers. They learned to create entire military installations using nothing more than canvas, wood, and an almost supernatural attention to detail. A sergeant named Bill Blass, who would later become famous for dressing wealthy women rather than fooling enemy armies, spent his evenings sketching tank track patterns by lamplight, perfecting the subtle variations that would make fake tire impressions look genuine from aerial reconnaissance. The psychological preparation proved as crucial as the technical training. These men were being asked to enter combat zones not to fight, but to be seen fighting. They would deploy fake equipment within range of enemy artillery, knowing that their success would be measured by how convincingly they could draw deadly fire toward their positions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They were training to become the most visible targets on the battlefield, while hoping desperately to remain invisible to death itself. As their skills developed, so did their confidence in an almost unbelievable proposition: that imagination, properly applied, could deflect bullets, that creativity could save lives, that in a war where industrial might and technological superiority seemed to determine victory, sometimes the most powerful weapon was a story told so well that enemies would bet their lives on believing it. By 1944, the Pacific War had become a chess game played with human lives across an ocean that stretched beyond imagination. Each island taken, each atoll secured, brought Allied forces closer to Japan's home waters and made Japanese resistance increasingly desperate. The jungle clearing where those rubber tanks would soon fool enemy artillery was just one square on a vast board where every move carried the weight of thousands of lives. Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated from challenging to catastrophic. The supply lines that once fed their far-flung empire now resembled a spiderweb with most strands severed. Ships that might have carried ammunition were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Artillery shells that had once seemed abundant were now rationed like precious medicines. Every decision to open fire carried the weight of scarcity. Wasted ammunition meant soldiers who might die defenseless tomorrow. The jungle environment itself had become another enemy. In the steaming heat of the Solomon Islands, metal rusted almost as you watched, equipment malfunctioned with maddening regularity, and diseases that had no names in any field manual claimed more casualties than enemy bullets. American forces, despite their material advantages, found themselves fighting not just Japanese soldiers, but the very landscape that seemed determined to swallow everything human-made. It was in this context of environmental hostility and resource desperation that Allied deception units saw their opportunity. The techniques that had proven so effective in the European theatre, where dummy tanks might fool German pilots flying overhead, needed adaptation for a war fought in dense jungle where aerial reconnaissance was limited but artillery observation was deadly accurate. The solution came from understanding Japanese tactical doctrine better than the Japanese understood it themselves. Enemy commanders, trained in the aggressive artillery tactics that had served them well in China and early Pacific campaigns, still relied heavily on concentrated bombardments to soften targets before infantry assaults. If you could convince them to waste their precious shells on empty jungle, you could blunt their offensive capabilities before the real battle even began. American deception specialists began adapting their European playbook for Pacific realities. Rubber tanks had to be modified to withstand humidity that could rot canvas overnight. Sound equipment needed waterproofing that could survive monsoon rains. Most challenging of all, the visual illusions had to work not just from the air, but from the ground-level observation posts that Japanese forces favored in jungle warfare. The psychological profile of their enemy also required careful study. Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on honor and aggressive action, made commanders particularly susceptible to certain kinds of deception. They were trained to attack perceived weakness immediately, to concentrate firepower on visible targets without lengthy reconnaissance. This cultural tendency toward decisive action, normally a tactical advantage, could be turned against them by offering tempting targets that existed only to waste their strength. The stage was set for a performance that would cost some audiences far more than the price of admission. Let's return to that humid October evening, but this time from both sides of the deception. As Japanese spotters adjusted their binoculars and American artists held their breath, two entirely different wars were about to intersect in the most unlikely way possible. Sergeant Yamamoto crouched in his observation post, mosquitoes whining around his sweat-soaked uniform. He had been watching the American positions for 3 days, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. Through his field glasses, he could see what appeared to be a full company of Sherman tanks positioned carelessly in the open, the kind of tactical mistake that suggested either American arrogance or American desperation. Either way, it represented a chance to inflict serious damage with minimal risk. 2 miles away, Staff Sergeant Robert Tompkins of the 23rd Special Troops pressed himself against a tree trunk, listening to the distant sound of Japanese artillery crews preparing their guns. Tompkins had been a scenic designer for summer stock theatre in Connecticut before the war transformed him into what he privately thought of as a professional liar. The rubber tanks he and his team had positioned were masterpieces of deceptive craftsmanship, complete with fake mud streaks, artfully positioned camouflage netting, and even dummy crew members positioned at precisely the angles that would suggest real soldiers taking shelter. The Japanese artillery preparation took on an almost ceremonial quality in the jungle darkness. Shell after precious shell was loaded into tubes that had been carefully aimed at coordinates that promised maximum destruction. Battery commanders whispered final adjustments, their voices carrying the weight of months of frustration against an enemy that seemed to possess unlimited resources. This would be their answer to American material superiority: concentrated, devastating fire, power applied with surgical precision. When the bombardment began, it lit up the night with terrible beauty. Orange flames erupted from Japanese positions as shells screamed through the humid air, their passage marked by the distinctive whistle that had terrified soldiers on a dozen different battlefields. Trees splintered and fell. The ground itself seemed to heave upward as high explosives tore through earth and vegetation. For nearly 20 minutes, the Japanese guns poured their fury into the American position. Round after round hammered the clearing where the Sherman tanks sat helplessly exposed. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous thunder that sent wildlife fleeing deeper into the jungle and made communication impossible except through hand signals. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the artillery fell silent. Gun crews strained their ears, listening for the secondary explosions that should have marked ammunition stores detonating, fuel tanks igniting, the death screams of American armor. Instead, they heard only the jungle returning to its normal symphony of insects and night birds. When dawn finally broke and the smoke cleared enough to assess the damage, Japanese observers found themselves staring at something that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Where tons of high explosive had landed, where Sherman tanks should have been reduced to twisted metal and charred corpses, there was nothing but shredded rubber and torn canvas fluttering weakly in the morning breeze. The silence that followed was more devastating than any artillery barrage could have been. The rubber tank deception was just one note in a symphony of lies that Allied forces were conducting across the Pacific theater. As word of its success spread through intelligence networks, other units began orchestrating increasingly elaborate performances designed to make Japanese commanders dance to music that existed only in their minds. On Saipan, American engineers constructed an entire dummy airfield complete with plywood aircraft that looked convincingly real from Japanese observation posts 3 miles away. Enemy artillery, following standard doctrine, concentrated their limited ammunition on destroying what they believed to be a crucial Allied airbase. For 5 days, shells rained down on empty runways and fake hangars, while the real American aircraft operated from a hidden field carved out of jungle on the island's opposite side. The psychological impact of these deceptions rippled through Japanese command structures in ways that intelligence analysts were only beginning to understand. Radio intercepts revealed increasing frustration among enemy officers who found themselves questioning their own observations. If tanks could be phantoms, if airfields could vanish like mirages, what other intelligence could they trust? Meanwhile, the American artists and technicians responsible for these illusions lived in a strange psychological space between pride and melancholy. They measured their success in enemy shells wasted, in Japanese soldiers who fired at empty air instead of real targets. But this inverted logic of victory, where success meant being shot at by people trying to kill you, created its own form of combat stress. Private First Class Morton Rothstein, formerly a commercial artist from Chicago, wrote in a letter to his wife, "Yesterday we built a fake supply depot that looked so real I wanted to requisition equipment from it myself. Today the Japs held it for 6 hours straight. I should feel proud, but mostly I just feel sorry for them. They're trying so hard to hurt us, and we keep giving them nothing to hit." The deception operations expanded beyond simple visual tricks. Sound trucks broadcasted the recorded noise of tank movements and construction activity, creating auditory illusions of massive military buildup where only small units actually operated. Radio operators transmitted elaborate fictional communications between imaginary units, complete with detailed operational plans designed to be intercepted and misinterpreted by Japanese intelligence. Perhaps most remarkably, These psychological operations began affecting American forces as well. Soldiers operating near dummy installations reported feeling genuinely protected by fake anti-aircraft guns and phantom artillery pieces. The human mind, it seemed, could be fooled by its own side's deceptions, creating a kind of feedback loop where lies became psychologically real, even for those who had created them. The war of illusions was reshaping not just battlefield tactics, but the very nature of reality in a combat zone where nothing could be trusted and everything might be a lie designed to kill you. The toll of fighting ghosts began manifesting in Japanese units in ways that military psychiatrists had never documented. Soldiers reported seeing American tanks that vanished when approached, hearing the sounds of massive troop movements that led to empty jungle, receiving orders to attack positions that existed only on maps drawn by enemy deception specialists. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, a veteran artillery officer who had fought from Guadalcanal to the Philippines, found himself second-guessing every target acquisition. The rubber tank incident had shaken something fundamental in his tactical thinking. "How do you fight an enemy that isn't there?" he confided to his diary in an entry that would later be recovered by American intelligence. "We fire our guns at shadows while real Americans kill real Japanese soldiers somewhere else." The psychological warfare was working both ways across no man's land. American deception specialists, despite their technical successes, struggled with the surreal nature of their mission. They were artists trying to create death through beauty, craftsmen whose masterpieces were designed to be destroyed by people they were trying to deceive. The disconnect between creative impulse and military necessity created a unique form of combat stress that army psychiatrists weren't equipped to treat. Sergeant Bill McClellan, who had painted advertising billboards in civilian life, developed what he called reality drift, moments when he couldn't distinguish between the fake equipment he had created and genuine military hardware. "Sometimes I'd walk past a real tank and wonder if I had painted it," he would later recall. The line between what was real and what we had made started disappearing. Everything felt like a prop in some massive theatre production where the audience was trying to kill the actors. Japanese intelligence officers tasked with separating truth from fiction in American dispositions found themselves paralyzed by uncertainty. Reports from field observers became increasingly tentative, filled with qualifiers and expressions of doubt. Possible tank concentration replaced tank concentration confirmed. Apparent artillery positions substituted for artillery positions identified. The language of military intelligence was being infected by the virus of uncertainty that Allied deception specialists had introduced into Japanese decision-making processes. The broader strategic implications were profound. Japanese commanders, never knowing which targets were real, began spreading their limited firepower across multiple possibilities rather than concentrating it effectively. Artillery that might have devastated actual American positions was instead divided among phantom targets, diluting its impact to manageable levels. But perhaps the most insidious effect was the erosion of institutional confidence. Japanese military culture, built on certainty and decisive action, found itself undermined by persistent doubt. Officers who had once made tactical decisions with samurai-like conviction now hesitated, questioned, second-guessed themselves. The Americans had weaponized uncertainty itself, turning it loose in enemy command structures like a virus that attacked the will to fight as effectively as bullets attacked the body. Decades after the last shot was fired in the Pacific, two old men sat in a veterans' hospital in San Diego, their conversation drifting between memories of different wars fought on the same battlefields. One had been a Japanese artillery observer, the other an American deception specialist. Both carried the weight of that October night in 1944, when shells met rubber and reality bent like heated metal. "I still dream about those tanks," admitted Kenji Watanabe, now in his 80s, his English careful but clear. 40 years later, and I still see them collapsing when the wind blew. My gun crew thought we were going crazy." Across from him, Robert Tompkins nodded with the understanding that only comes from shared absurdity. We painted mud on rubber for 3 days to make those things look real. I was more proud of that work than anything I did in advertising after the war. The conversation revealed something profound about the nature of the deception campaigns. They had affected everyone involved, victor and vanquished alike. The Japanese soldiers who had been fooled carried the psychological scars of fighting an enemy that existed only in imagination. The American artists who had created those illusions struggled to return to a peacetime world where their lies were no longer matters of life and death. The broader legacy of the Pacific deception operations extended far beyond individual trauma. Military strategists studying the war recognized that something fundamental had changed in the nature of conflict itself. Wars were no longer fought solely with steel and flesh, but with information and perception. The ability to control what an enemy believed had proven as valuable as controlling what they could see. In the jungles where those rubber tanks had once swayed in the humid breeze, nature had long since reclaimed the clearings where men once played deadly games of hide and seek. The canvas and plywood had rotted away, leaving no physical trace of the elaborate deceptions that had once saved lives and wasted ammunition. But the ghosts of those phantom armies lingered in military doctrine, in the understanding that modern warfare would increasingly be fought in the space between truth and lies. The Japanese soldiers who had laughed at wobbling tanks learned that war's greatest terror wasn't the enemy you could see. It was the one that existed only in your mind, waiting patiently for you to waste your strength fighting shadows while death approached from directions you never thought to watch.